Eumeswil by Ernst Jünger, 1977. Produced by Parker Banks at pbanks.net and youtube.com/pbanks. Isolation and security. 14. The days in the Kasbah are fairly uniform. I can barely distinguish between work and leisure. I like them equally. This is consistent with my principle that there can be no empty time, no minute without intellectual tension and alertness. If a man succeeds in playing life as a game, he will find honey in nettles and hemlock. He will even enjoy adversity and peril. What causes the feeling of constantly being on vacation? Probably the fact that the mental person liberates the physical one and observes his game. Far from any hierarchy, he enjoys the harmony of rest and motion, of invulnerability and extreme sensitivity, at times even authorship. He writes his text on a blank page and vanquishes destiny. The world changes through writing. This is the marriage of dance and melody. On the other hand, I am also constantly on duty. This applies not only to my mental participation in everything that occurs in the Kasbah and in the night bar, but also to the everyday banalities as prescribed by the rules. There is nothing special about that. Many professions require constant preparedness, particularly if they involve danger. The preparedness is geared to the possibility that something might happen. Thus, it is a form of service in which nothing or little happens. If, however, something does occur, all hands are needed. This recalls the precautions for possible fires or catastrophes at sea. With a drill at the start of the voyage, they make sure that everyone knows his function and his lifeboat. He is to find it like a sleepwalker when the siren wakes him up. Thus, the Kasbah has a quarterly drill for coping with domestic unrest. This is little more than an armed stroll. Otherwise, my days are my own, and often enough my nights, for the Condor does not always feel like going to the bar after mess. Nor is it always an extended session. Often a Turkish coffee, a flute of champagne, or a digestive suffices. I scarcely need emphasize that the nights that stand me in good stead are precisely those involving long and hard drinking. Sometimes a whole week can go by before I don my skiff. A bed of roses, at least for most people, and even more so for me because of the intellectual pleasure. That's the fly in the ointment. So says my dear brother, who, just like my genitor, sees me doing things that are unworthy of a university teacher. To his mind, I am waiting on the tyrant in his indulgences and assisting him in his oppression, a man who shoots at the populace, and without even having to do so, old Josiah is turning in his grave. My good brother forgets that I sometimes got him and the old man out of hot water when they ventured a bit further than their usual pussyfooting. And what does a fly in the ointment mean during a time when a movement is successful only if oblique? We play on slanting chessboards. If someday his pontiffs and I, do not doubt it, topple the Condor, then Eumeswil will once again celebrate Liberazione, the transition, that is, from visible to anonymous power. For a long time now, soldiers and demagogues have been spelling one another. Although I have often studied this issue at the Luminar, I feel that our scholarship has not managed to draw an adequate typological distinction between tyrant, despot, and demagogue. These notions overlap, and telling them apart is difficult, since they designate a deeply rooted human faculty which changes iridescently in individuals. This is demonstrated in practice, since anyone who seizes power is initially hailed and cheered. Man is born violent but is kept in check by the people around him. If he nevertheless manages to throw off his fetters, he can count on applause, for everyone recognizes himself in him. Deeply ingrained, nay, buried dreams come true. The unlimited radiates its magic even upon crime, which, not coincidentally, is the main source of entertainment in Eumeswil. I, as an anarch, not uninterested but disinterested, can understand that. Freedom has a wide range and more facets than a diamond. I pursued this part of my studies ad hoc in order to visualize the Condor's condition. Through the Luminar, I was presented with a wealth of types and also of eras in which these types were concentrated. Greek and especially Sicilian cities, satrapies in Asia Minor, late Roman and Byzantine Caesars, Renaissance city-states, including over and over on Vigo's behalf as well, Florence and Venice. Then the very brief and bloody uprisings of the Oklos, knights of hatchets and long knives, and finally the prolonged dictatorships of the proletariat with their backgrounds and shadings. The days and nights at the Luminar take me into a labyrinth where I am afraid of getting lost. Life is too short for that. But how tremendously time and times expand when one enters them through a straight gate. It is fascinating. I need no drugs for that, or barely the beaker that I hold in my hand. Say, Matarazzo's Chronicle of Perugia, the history of a city among cities in a land among lands. I crossfade pictures of Etruscan gates, Pisano's choir, paintings by Baglioni, Pietro Perugino, by the 12-year-old Raphael. Even this tiny section snowballs ad infinitum, as does every source, every point that I touch in whatever has been handed down. I sense a crackling, then a shining. That is the historical charge in its intact and undivided power. Friends and enemies, perpetrators and victims have contributed their best. I spend the fully exhausted time in front of the Luminar, whether in the Casbah or down in Vigo's Institute. The mood then infects my work up here or my strolls in the city. This does not mean that I lead a literary existence like an epigone. I actually see the present more sharply, like someone looking up from the carpet on which he has said his prayer. The warp is supplied by the centuries, the woof by the day. This creates a distance for nearby things. People and facts gain a background. They become more bearable. How then shall I classify the condor? Among the tyrants, though not to be doubted, it says little. According to linguistic usage, tyrants find a more fertile soil in the west and despots in the east. Both are unbounded, but the tyrant follows certain rules, the despot his cravings. That is why tyranny is bequeathed more easily, though at most to a grandchild. The bodyguard is likewise more reliable, as is one's own son. Despite profound disagreements, Lycophron, the son of Periander, rebels against his father only in spirit but not in deed. According to the classical scheme, the condor is not one of the older tyrants who attained power by fighting the aristocracy or murdering the king. In Eumeswil, this has been out of the question for some time now. The old tyrants, to be sure, did preliminary work as blenders of people, not only by destroying the elites and egalitarianizing the demos into a mass, but also by deporting people and filling the gaps with foreign mercenaries and workers. From decade to decade, this reduces any domestic resistance that evinces quality. The upheavals become chronic, but alter nothing. The types that follow one another are all alike, especially in their willpower. They also use the same big words as a kind of fireworks that drowns out the live shooting. Regardless of his South American tinges, the condor recalls the older tyranny only in that he has taste. As a soldier, he read little. He tries to make up for this lack by having artists and philosophers in the Casbah, and also men of science and intelligent artisans. I benefited from this proclivity when he set up the lavish Luminar for me. On some evenings in the night bar, I enjoy reminiscences of Sicyon, Corinth, Samos, and especially the Syracuse of the ancient potentates. I won't deny it. One consequence of the worldwide entanglement is that solitary men appear, talents not rooted in one specific landscape or tradition. They loom up from the plain as lonesome peaks. Granted, no style can develop in this way. There is no place, no exchange among lofty piers, no gaudy colonnade, no master's workshop. At times it seems as if the surface tension were being discharged through a fireball. Scarcely linked to place and time, the important individual turns generous. Major and minor potentates try to bind him. They adopt him. The Yellow Khan prefers planners, architects for Asiatic residences. His pendant prefers artists and metaphysicians. They can be seen in Eumeswil, though not as permanent guests, but as infrequent visitors in retinues or in transit. Still and all, I am satisfied with the discussions between the condor, Attila, and the domo. Incidentally, one also hears astonishing answers from the minions when they are addressed. I am thinking of the smooth-haired pages, whose profiles are virtually carved out of carnelian. Later on, many of them advance to high offices. A late Diadocus, then? It is not for nothing that we dwell in Eumeswil. Of the character traits that were indispensable for a Diadochus, this Eumenes, according to one historian, lacked odiousness. The same might apply to the condor. He also lacks cruelty. He even finds it repulsive. But I wonder why I myself cannot reach a satisfactory comparison. It must be the fault of the dilution, like a beverage that has been constantly brewed and rebrewed from the same leaves. We live on depleted organic substance. The atrocities of early myths, Mycenae, Persepolis, the ancient and the younger tyrannies, the Diadochi and the Epigoni, the decadence of the Western and then the Eastern Roman Empire, the Renaissance princes and the conquistadors, plus the exotic palette from Dahomey to the Aztecs. It would seem as if the motifs were exhausted, sufficing for neither deeds nor misdeeds, at most for faint reminiscences. As a historian, I know how to elude all that by moving through history as through an art gallery, surrounded by masterpieces. I am familiar with them through my studies. However, once released from any attachment, I know its rank. I grasp the human quality buried deep in its strata, in Cain and Abel, in the prince as in the coolie. 15. Thus, I am always on duty, both in the Kasbah and in the city. When fully back to teaching, I am exempted from my obligation up here, but people think of me as a sympathizer, and I am known as such not only to the Condor and his staff, but also to his opponents. This I must reckon with, although, as I have already explained, there are limits to my sympathy. I tend to distinguish between other people's opinions of me and my own self-assessment. Others determine my social status, which I take seriously, albeit once again within certain limits. Nor am I dissatisfied with it. In this respect I differ from most Eumeswilers who are dissatisfied with their positions or their standing. I could just as easily say that I neither am satisfied with my position nor take it seriously. That would obtain for the overall situation of the city the absence of any centre, which puts every office under obligation and gives meaning to every action. Here, neither oath nor sacrifice counts any longer. Nevertheless, when anything is possible, one can also take any liberty. I am an anarch, not because I despise authority, but because I need it. Likewise, I am not a non-believer, but a man who demands something worth believing in. On this point, I am like a bride in her chamber. She listens for the softest step. My demand is based, if not entirely, then to a large extent, on my education. Am a historian, and as such I know what can be offered in terms of ideas, images, melodies, buildings, characters. My current situation is that of an engineer in a demolition firm. He works with a clear conscience insofar as the castles and cathedrals, indeed even the old patrician mansions, have long since been torn down. I am a lumberjack in forests with 30-year cutting cycles. If a regime holds out that long, it may consider itself lucky. The best one can expect is a modest legality. Legitimacy is out of the question. The coats of arms have been robbed of their insignia or replaced by flags. Incidentally, it is not that I am awaiting a return to the past like Chateaubriand or a recurrence like Boutefeu. I leave those matters politically to the conservatives and cosmically to the stargazers. No, I hope for something equal, nay, stronger, and not just in the human domain. Naglfar, the ship of the apocalypse, shifts into a calculable position. I cannot fail to regard myself with a certain sense of humor when I lecture to an auditorium that jumps only at the most bromidic and faddish bait. The serpent becomes an earthworm here. My sense of propriety gets more of its money's worth when, in my steward's uniform, I wait on the Condor and his guests. Thus I take my duties seriously within an overall context that I reject for its mediocrity. The important thing is that my rejection actually refers to the totality and does not take up within it a stance that can be defined as conservative, reactionary, liberal, ironic, or in any way social. One should avoid changing one's work shift in the ever-increasing corvée of the Civil War. On this premise, I can, to be sure, take seriously what I do here. I know that the subsoil moves, perhaps like a landslide or an avalanche, and that is precisely why relationships remain undisturbed in their details. I lie aslant on a slanting plane. The distances between people do not change. I actually see them more sharply against the deceptive background. Their standing so close to the abyss also arouses my sympathy. At times I see them as if I were walking through the streets of Pompeii before the eruption of Vesuvius. This is one of the historian's delights, and even more, his sorrow. If we see someone doing something for the last time, even just eating a piece of bread, this activity becomes wondrously profound. We participate in the transmutation of the ephemeral into the sacramental. We have inklings of eras during which such a sight was an everyday occurrence. Thus I am present as if Eumeswil were a dream, a game, or even an experiment. This does not rule out personal sympathy, which after all we do feel when we are moved by a play at the theatre. Given my brand of observation, I would rather associate with Vigo and Bruno than with my genitor and my dear brother. Were I to behave like them, I would be rooted in an agitation that does not appeal to me in any way, whether I view it from above, from below, from the right, or from the left. The condor would then be the tyrant for me, not just factually but also morally. Tyrants must be hated, so I would hate him. Or else he embodies the will to power as extolled by Boutefeu, a great navigator. He steers us through the waves and storms of the struggle for life. I then model myself after him. I follow him without giving it a second thought. I idolize him. Be that as it may, these are feelings that I ward off. When I, as a historian, view us en famille, it strikes me that I dwell one story higher than my father and my brother, in rooms where one lives more unabashedly. I could come down at any time. That would be the historian's descent into politics, a change that might have good and even noble reasons, yet would in any case entail a loss of freedom. Such is the role of the anarch, who remains free of all commitments, yet can turn in any direction. A customer sits outside one of the famous cafes whose names have gone down in literary history. I picture him as, say, Manet, one of the old artists, might have painted him, with a short, dark beard, a round hat, a cigar in his hand, his features both relaxed and concentrated, that is, silently yet attentively at ease with himself and the world. In those days, great personal freedom must have been possible. The café is near the Chambre des Députés. Well-known contemporaries pass by, ministers, deputies, officers, artists, attorneys. The waiters are starting to reset the indoor tables for the evening customers. The écaille comes with the oyster baskets. The first streetwalkers show up. Ambiance. Around this time, the big cities begin dreaming. The night casts out its veil. The customer sees familiar and unfamiliar people who try to involve him in a conversation, a business deal, a pleasure. But no matter how many people go by, he ignores their overtures. Otherwise, the treasure accumulating in him would be frittered away in small change. Their images move him more profoundly than their fleeting presences. If he were a painter, he would store their images in his mind and liberate them in masterpieces. If he were a poet, he would revive the mood for himself and for many others, the harmony of the people and the houses, the paling of the colors and the awakening of tones with the thickening night. Everything flows into everything else and melds. Tout jusqu'au souvenir, tout s'envole, tout fuit on est seul avec Paris l'onde de la nuit. All things and even memories flee out of sight, and you're alone with Paris and the wave and the night. Like any pleasure, this one too is whetted by abstinence. Sensibility, and with it the sensations, are heightened into an incredibly keen scent. Invisible harmony flows more and more intensely into visible harmony until it dazzles. The cafe customer could enter reality at any time. If he withholds himself and lingers in non-desire, then this means that the offer is as yet inadequate for the hypersensitive suitor. Now the figures writhe in more and more violent throes. They want to be recognized. The rock awaits Moses, whose staff is about to touch it. 16. Now how about that fly in the ointment? This is the way my father and my brother refer to my service, particularly during domestic turmoil, when they hole up in our little house, not re-emerging until the worst is over. They have 2 flags in the attic, not just in theory but also in fact, and they hang them out according to the weather. If the condor has stood fast, they can flaunt their white vests. Should his enemies triumph, then my father and my brother have always supported them. Perhaps they once attended a course on Giordano Bruno. They now blow it up into a heroic deed. Every historian knows what antithetical lights can be projected on men and powers. I never cease to be amazed at how unabashedly my genitor tries to dovetail his basically praiseworthy theories with our slanting reality. I, in contrast, know that I lie aslant within a slanting reality, and I believe it is precisely this knowledge that gives thought some integrity. When acting, I, by the way, do so not aslant but obliquely, consistent with the situation and devoid of self-pity, a distinction that can no longer be taken for granted in Eumeswil. The Condor sticks to Machiavelli's doctrine that a good military and good laws are the fundaments of the state. One might add that our daily bread has to be assured. Such is the case, and the butter too, especially at the games. It is precisely here, at the athletic contests, in the marketplaces as well, and more seldom in the law courts, that tumults may erupt. The police quell them easily. The Domo prefers to let them simply run their course. They feel worn out once they've done enough rampaging. He also thinks that the best police force, like a good housewife, is the kind that is least spoken of. He is relieved of some of his worries by television. Here, too, games and melodramas are more popular than politics. Besides, the masses are thus divided among their households. Furthermore, the Condor enjoys popular favor, so domestic turmoil is seldom to be expected, although possible at any time. It then catches us unawares, like an earthquake. For a long time now, the classical revolutions have been supplanted by military putches which spell one another. Even the tribunes require a general above all. This is a truism. The predecessor's corruption is a leitmotif. In this, too, they are nearly always right. There are variants when the new rulers present themselves. A few cite the populace and its will. The others, like the Condor, are satisfied with the power of facts. In some cases, there is a joviality that inspires confidence. Either way, both the police and the military have to be watched over. This includes generals and Praetorian guards. Cliques of guard officers like those from which the Orlovs ascended are hard to imagine in the Kasbah. Still, the Condor's father was a simple sergeant. The Domo has confidential agents all the way down to the battalions, and then again others who watch over those agents. This should not be regarded as espionage. The current method is more casual. My dear Sergeant, you know the Condor's high opinion of you. At parades he is addressed by name and has the opportunity of distinguishing himself. No wonder he is also ordered to attend the report session. A capable soldier, an open adherent, there is no secrecy involved, no hint of snooping. And it goes without saying that the Domo stays in direct contact with the troops. I see one or another of the boys when the Condor takes him along to the night bar after mess, a special distinction. Open faces, thoroughly uncritical, gullible. That is a third variant of conduct in Eumeswil, failure to recognize the slanting situation, which I accept as a task while my genitor misjudges it. Gullibility is the norm. It is the credit on which states live. Without it, even their most modest survival would be impossible. Thus, domestic turmoil is unlikely, but when riots erupt, they go for broke. They would also start right in with serious actions, naval mutinies, occupation of radio stations, proclamations by officers, and above all, an attack on the Condor. That was how he himself seized power. Attempts of this ilk can seldom be fully hushed up. Something usually leaks out. Many uprisings have succeeded only because the rulers failed to take the early symptoms seriously, and the symptoms are prefaced by an incubation period. It is unlikely that the Domo could be caught by surprise. The intelligence system runs perfectly. The morning bulletin apprises him of anything special that has occurred during the night. Once a day, the chief of police comes with his report, in which, inter alia, the postal surveillance and the chronique scandaleuse play a role. There is no essential difference between the police and the military. To the extent that we can speak of war between our fellow states, this is usually a fire encroaching on foreign territories. After all, they are dependent on the empires. Tyranny goes by the law of the hunting preserve. If any of the young hearts thinks he can defy the royal stag, they engage in a test of strength. Then all hell breaks loose. The Domo puts out a red alert, first for an entire minute, then at repeated intervals. This is followed by a message to the phonophores. A normally silent frequency is now opened, of course only on apparatuses that, like mine, are suitably equipped. The units gather at the alarm posts. Every man knows what he has to do. 17. If I happen to be in the Kasbah when the alert comes, I first get into my fighting gear, which, like a life jacket on a ship, lies packed up beneath my bed, comfortable overalls with boots and a cap. Everything is dyed the reddish shade of the castle cliff. Iron rations, bandages and such fill a sack. Not even the small flask of cognac has been overlooked. The armory is in the cellar. From there I fetch guns and ammunition. 2 cabin stewards report to me. Since they work for me in the Kasbah, I know them from our everyday dealings. The 3 of us then descend one of the paths that meander down to the city, and we station ourselves at mid-course. There used to be a small watchtower here, but it collapsed during the great earthquake. A stump has survived. Covered with reeds, it resembles one of the shacks that were built for duck hunting down below on the Sus. There we settle in. First I send the other 2 a bit further down, to a sign that says, "No trespassing." They tear off the metallic foil, and a death's head appears in phosphorescent paint. The domo expects the police to refrain from using their firearms. Even shooting in self-defense has to be justified in subsequent reports. If, however, they are authorized to shoot, then he demands that they aim at the individual and with intent to kill. My 2 assistants set up the preliminary warning sign and then come back. I assign the guard schedule and discuss the possibilities with them. The cabin stewards switch off with one another. Probably one of the Chinese cooks who also serve as waiters and a Lebanese named Nebek are part of our unit. The cook has a long name. His fellow workers call him Kung. A fat fellow wouldn't be of much use. His girlfriend Ping Sin lives in the city. I can picture them. The Lebanese listens in joyous expectation. Since he likes to shoot, he hopes that it will be our crew that gets attacked. His vocabulary is rich in aggressive expressions, especially up in the Kasbah when he has not visited his lady-love for weeks on end. Shoot, hit, mow 'em down. The Chinese sits back comfortably, folding his hands on his belly. In reality, nothing much can happen here. It's an excellent position. Anyone passing the warning sign would be courting suicide. By day, the sign could be spotted from far down on the slope, and by night, the outpost would alert us with signal flares and through the phonophore. It is impossible to leave the path, for the castle cliff is covered over with a prickly euphorbia which the populace calls more venomous than a mother-in-law. An attack could be mounted only on the paved road and not without military arms. A lot must happen beforehand. I ponder my mission from 3 points of view. First as the Condor's night steward, then as a historian, and finally as an anarch. It occurs to me that my instructions overlook, or rather ignore, one possibility, a very crucial one, which they must have taken into account. I am referring to the eventuality that attackers might advance on us from the rear. Should that occur, then the Kasbah would have to be in their hands already. Presumably this would be done stealthily, for if it followed an assault, we would notice it. From our shack, we can view a bend in the access road and thus contribute, albeit modestly, to the defense. So that would be the classic case of a palace revolution. All it takes is a few shots, perhaps a dagger. The relationship between the ruler's seat and the capital is one of the problems of comparative historiography. The citadel can stand either inside or outside the city. The inner location offers the advantage of immediate proximity. A revolt can be nipped in the bud. The outer location, in contrast, provides latitude for reflecting and then for pressing the long arm of the lever. The distance from the capital should be precisely calculated. Eumeswil can be surveyed from the Kasbah, which in turn is hard to climb up to. Capri is very far from Rome. Nevertheless, from that island, Tiberius, through diplomatic maneuvering, succeeded in thwarting Sejanus's dangerous conspiracy. Yet he kept ships ready in the harbor. In ease he had to flee. We know of ancient oriental palaces that stood inside the city walls. Each, however, had an underground escape route. In hereditary monarchies, a residence outside the capital can assume the character of a chateau de plaisance or a summer villa. The tyrant, in contrast, must always be prepared. He would do well to have eyes in the back of his head. At the night bar, the condor and the domo sit with their backs against the wall. Mirrors are installed in other rooms, even the corridors. That is why I think they cannot possibly have failed to take a palace revolution into account. On the contrary, this is one of the notions haunting the tyrant even in his dreams, perhaps intensifying into forms of madness that can be highly dangerous, especially for his intimates. Such an obsession can even destroy a good character, like that of Tiberius. No wonder the historians have such conflicting opinions of him. Another reason why my employment in the Kasbah is pleasant is that the distrust does not transcend the boundaries of objectively justified caution. The overall tone is terse, not without a benevolence that can become almost warm at night. Mutual respect is seldom violated. The level sinks only when the Yellow Khan visits with his people. But such moments offer a great deal to observe. I do admit I would not mind serving a Tiberius. That would be closer to the historical substance whose final infusion I am tasting here. The period following Actium opened up tremendous prospects, of which only some were realized. Vigo pointed out the background, the destruction of Mark Antony's fleet in the shadow of the Arcana. On the one side Isis and Osiris, on the other Apollo. Octavian to his brother-in-law, "Thy name should be Serapion, not Antony." Asclepius was also present. Mark Antony's ships were made of wood from the grove that was sacred to the god on the island of Kos. After the victory, Augustus had Publius Turullius executed for that sacrilege. I must not go into detail, otherwise I may start dreaming. The African assaults on Europe are almost as thrilling as the Asiatic ones, and by their very nature more colorful. But I was discussing Tiberius, who, I find, lost some grand opportunities by moving to Capri. This error was repeated historically on a much smaller scale when, say, the Duke of Orléans, as regent, wanted to devote himself entirely to his debaucheries with his roué, and so he unloaded all business on the abominable Guillaume Dubois. Tiberius is remarkable for his character. The sheer fact that he, virtually as a private citizen, could hold on to the reins for such a long time verges on witchcraft. Nor were magical features lacking in him. Even today, when shepherds on Capri talk about Il Tiberio, their intonation has a strange lilt. He lingers in the rocks. I have often summoned him to the Luminar late at night. Some of his days are registered there virtually minute by minute. Now and then such details are important, because historiography is forced to rely on abbreviations. But I also want to know when, for how long, and in whose company such a man was bored. I want to participate in his boredom. In this respect, the historian is akin to a good actor who identifies with his role. Naturally, there are different conceptions. They are unavoidable. Even a brilliant composer will not find a conductor who interprets him historically. Of course, sharp deviations often distort less than imponderable ones. If the background of the notes, their own existence and instinctual life, are grasped through congenial improvisation, then the time of destiny triumphs over the time of history. I was reckless enough to broach this topic at the family table, only to reap an answer worthy of my genitor, namely, that the invention of the phonograph has rendered such speculations null and void. The inventor was, I believe, an especially disagreeable American, a disciple of Franklin's named Edison. After all, as things stand, but it was sensible of me to avoid any rejoinder. Not only is technology changing, but so is the human ear. So even if a recording is perfect, we hear differently, aside from the fact that even the best machine cannot replace an absent orchestra. To be sure, with that invention, jukeboxes began to invade music. This led to the first universal musical style, and therewith to the generalizing and vulgarizing of folk tunes, and also, incidentally, to an arsenal of extremely hideous instruments. I often listen to them. Each style has its own content. The era of warring states managed to bring forth almost nothing but nostalgic reminiscences, and the physicians had to treat more patients who had gone deaf in the musical infernos than in the wars. Now, I am not putting down the universal style as one of the anarch's hopes. A new Orpheus could do justice to the world along with its heavens and hells. I can enjoy intuitive improvisations at the luminar. For generations, important minds must have hoarded and shaped the material of world history in the catacombs. Such things are possible during long periods of security, especially when they are played as a game. A passion for the archival and a eunuch-like chinoiserie add to the fun, as does fear of annihilation and also of universal wars. The archives of the Vatican would fill only a niche there. I often wonder what this archivistic instinct is aiming at. It seems to transcend any historical intention. Perhaps it is laboring for an Emir Musa of future deserts and wastelands. Where was I now? Oh yes, Tiberius. And I was wondering how I would have served him on Capri. My job here in the Casbah helps me chiefly as a historical model. I believe I have a certain knack for dealing with great men. As with moons and satellites, a mean distance is the most favorable. If you get too close to Jupiter, you burn up. If you keep far away, your observation suffers. You then move in theories and ideas instead of facts. Res non verba, whatever you commit or omit. It is generally good to be informed about physical laws. This is an important maxim. It guides the elephant, which tests the ground before taking each step. Once, at the night bar, Rosner started talking about this animal. He told us, among other things, that when it finds itself sinking into quicksand or a bog, it never hesitates to swing up its trunk, lift its rider from his seat, and thrust him under its foot like a piece of wood. The domo, who has a mind for such anecdotes, said, "The fault lies with the driver who demands the impossible. This could never happen to an experienced mahout." He was probably correct. If you ride an elephant, you have to know what you are doing. Keeping a proper distance from a power wielder takes restraint. One must avoid approaching him on one's own, even with good intent, like that fisherman who had caught a gigantic sole, and when he brought it as a gift to Tiberius, reaped a nasty reward. The same thing happened to the centurion who was supposed to show the way to the bearers of Caesar's sedan, but wound up in a cul-de-sac. Caution is necessary, as when one is dealing with explosives. I'm thinking of that stargazer who, when ordered to predict the hour of his own death, had enough presence of mind to slip his head out of the noose. He said, "As I see, I am momentarily in great danger." The best job is one in which you see a lot and are seen little. In this respect, I am content with my work. At the night bar, I often fiddle around like a chameleon, as if melting into the wallpaper. Compared with Capri, these are small fry that I catch here. Meanwhile, I dream about Tiberius chatting with Macro at the triclinium as I refill the beakers of the Spintrians. Now a fateful name is spoken, Germanicus. The work, even if subordinate, or as my brother says, unworthy, causes me no headaches. It is the substratum of my observation. As a chauffeur, an interpreter, or a secretary for trivia, I would still do my job. Anything occurring on the side, a stifled smile, a backstage cue, yields more than the grand receptions and the speeches at the forum where the potentates stand on their buskins. That is grist for Plutarch's mill. I therefore prefer the history of courts and cultures to that of politics, and I prefer Herodotus to Thucydides. Action is more easily emulated than character. This is borne out by the bromidic reiterations in world history. Eumeswil may be a city of epigone and also fellers, but at least there is no sounding off for posterity, even in the Casbah. Minor everyday weal and woe are the stuff of conversation. People say I thrive on my work, and I do live up to this reputation. My day flows by agreeably. I have plenty of time for my studies. But when the waves surge high, as during the Yellow Khan's visits or at banquets, I volunteer for cabin service, and I also wait tables, which is not normally part of my job. My efforts are rewarded and known to everyone all the way up to the Domo. This provides me with leisure when Emanuelo turns into Martin at the Luminar. My about-face is not as simple as it may look at first glance. For one thing, I have to succeed in treating my work as a game that I both play and watch. This gives even dangerous places like the duck shack a charm of their own. It presumes that one can scrutinize oneself from a certain distance like a chess figure. In a word, that one sees historical classification as more important than personal classification. This may sound exacting, but it used to be required of any soldier. The special trait making me an anarch is that I live in a world which I ultimately do not take seriously. This increases my freedom. I serve as a temporary volunteer. In regard to self-distancing, I owe Bruno a thing or two. He also taught me techniques for overcoming fear. The soldier participating in an attack knew he might get wounded or killed. That was part of the job. It was even laudable. A hit here on the duck shack would be simply a fact unconnected to king or country, an industrial accident. This is something I have to reckon with. I am fascinated by the tactical situation and not its meager ideology. The Domo is aware of this. After a clash, the Condor hands out not medals and decorations, but donations of land and money. Also, the phonophore may be raised to a higher level. A more difficult problem is maltreatment, which involves deeply rooted notions of honor. The stroke that knighted a man was the last to be dealt with the flat of the sword. After that, only the edge was considered acceptable. The officer wounded in a national war was decorated. If he was slapped in a social context without getting satisfaction, he would have been socially disqualified. Thinkers with a cynical streak have always made fun of that. The cavalier who limps away with a smile after being kicked by a horse wants to see blood when an ass has banged him in the head. The World Civil War changed values. National wars are fought between fathers, civil wars between brothers. It has always been better to fall under the father's hand than into the brother's. It is easier being an enemy of another nation than another class. I do not wish to expatiate. It is enough for me to be at the Luminar and say compare the situation of prisoners of war in the 19th Christian century with the situation of social prisoners in the 20th, plus the differences between political vernaculars. According to Thofen, the debasement of these jargons has run parallel to the increase in mass pressure. If humanity is written on the standard, then this means not only the exclusion of the enemy from society, but the deprivation of all his human rights. This explains the resurgence of torture in vast areas, the deportations of whole populaces, the mercantile conception of mankind, the official and criminal forms of hostage-taking, the batteries of cannon, plus the grand words. It reminds me of my genitor, who has one foot in Periclean Athens and the other in Eumeswil. Playing the gentleman here would be possible only for actors, nor would anyone consider doing it anymore. Rather, people, such as my genitor and my brother, feel like martyrs. Half of Eumesville is inhabited by types who have suffered for an idea, or at least claim to have done so. They stood true to the flag, offered heroic resistance. In short, the worn-out military claptrap has reawakened. Upon taking a closer look, one sees that, with rare exceptions, they tried to save their hides just like anybody else. But one turns a blind eye to all that, so long as they do not overdo it. The anarch sticks to facts, not ideas. He suffers not for facts, but because of them, and usually through his own fault, as in a traffic accident. Certainly there are unforeseeable things, maltreatments. However, I believe I have attained a certain degree of self-distancing that allows me to regard this as an accident. We are still dealing with the duck shack. What am I to conclude from the fact that my instructions mention no possibility of a palace revolt? Such an event usually takes only minutes, ending with the destruction of the attacker or the attacked. Evidently, the Condor and the Domo have not considered the possibility of fleeing, and that fits in with my image of them. Thus, there is no need to instruct the outposts. This does not absolve me of judging the situation for myself. Being mowed down from the back and en passant is a peasant's fate and has little appeal. So I have to know what is happening at the Kasbah while we observe the access roads. Events could scarcely be altogether soundless. We can rely above all on the dogs. They can scent violence, participating in it with their howls. They also herald death with a peculiar whimpering. The dogs perceive it even from far away, and not through scent alone. Aside from that, I dispatch one of my sentinels up to the Kasbah at regular intervals in order to forage or maintain contact, as the primer for sentry groups terms it. I keep abreast, and I would be one of the first to learn that the Condor had been toppled. That would gain me some time. After such an overthrow, the city starts teeming like a beehive, half as before a wedding flight, half as during the killing of the drones. At home, father and brother confer on whether the old flag should be hung out. Rashness can be fatal. Perhaps I may have enough family feeling to inform them from up here. They would then be the first to know that the condor was lying in his own blood, and they could take their advantage. For the Anak, little is changed. Flags have meaning for him, but not sense. I have seen them in the air and on the ground like leaves in May and in November, and I have done so as a contemporary and not just as a historian. The May Day celebration will survive, but with a different meaning. New portraits will head up the processions. A date devoted to the Great Mother is re-profaned. A pair of lovers in the woods pays more homage to it. I mean the forest as something undivided, where every tree is still a liberty tree. For the Anak, little is changed when he strips off a uniform that he wore partly as fool's motley, partly as camouflage. It covers his spiritual freedom, which he will objectivate during such transitions. This distinguishes him from the anarchist who, objectively unfree, starts raging until he is thrust into a more rigorous straitjacket. The 2 sentries whom I previously commanded on behalf of the Condor are now immediately subordinate to me. That is, I subordinate them. I order them to unload their guns and get the ammunition to safety. Then I can confer with them, not because I need their advice, but because it makes a better impression. I have studied such debates. They involve a lot of talking, but there is always someone who knows what he wants and who has a cudgel in his sack. Things drift toward this cudgel. I will probably check once more on how far things have developed up in the Kasbah and down in the city. Nothing is more dangerous than relying on mere rumor. One easily gets into the role of the donkey who ventured out on the ice too early. La journée des dupes. This, too, is a recurring figure. The Chinese is quietistic. I will send him into the city. He will not stand out. Nebek has aggressive tendencies. He is more in place at the Kasbah. He will have to tell me whether he has seen the corpse. And, did you see not just the boots but also the face? Above all, who is now in charge up there? Perhaps he will already do a bit of looting up there? That is his due. I also have to reckon with his making a fuss. The Chinese, instead of coming back, may sell his gun in the city and stay with Ping Xin. That is likewise his due, and I will be rid of him. I will probably dismiss both men. They can contribute little to my safety and are more trouble than they are worth. The fact that I regard almost everyone as a potential traitor is one of my failings, but it has stood the test. Most of them need not even be tortured to talk. Indeed, torture appears to stimulate them. They talk for nothing. Presumably, I will have enough time to ferret out what game is being played and to what extent we can expect purges. Be that as it may, it will be imperative to go underground for a while. Every sensible person in Eumeswil reckons with this possibility. He changes homes, even if only for one night. He is in the country. He has a secret bank account. They vanish like frogs, resurfacing after several days, months, or years. They hibernate until a new springtime brings a new May Day. As for me, I do not foresee a long absence. After all, a night steward is not a big fish. However, he too had best remain invisible for now. Of greater concern is the fact that I am also suspect as a historian. Whole gaggles of impotent professors have shifted into political persecution. Even if I had nothing to fear from them, their sheer proximity would be unendurable. I would much rather wash dishes. It is also possible that I may strike my tents indefinitely. If things heated up in the Kasbah, people might even think I was dead. Such a form of disappearance is especially favorable to resurrection. 18. Disappearing is even better than submerging. I prefer the tactic of mice to that of frogs. I am thinking not of the black and the grey mice in houses and gardens, but of the tawny mouse in the bush forest, the one that resembles a tiny squirrel. It feeds on nuts that it gathers in early autumn to store in its winter nest. There, safe and sound, it hibernates for 6 months or longer while the leaves settle on the forest floor and the snow then covers them up. Following the mouse's example, I have planned ahead. The muscardin is a kinsman of the dormouse. In my childhood I already pictured the lives of such dreamers as highly comfortable. It is no coincidence that after my mother's death, I lost myself in this protective world. Lonely as I was in the attic, I became the muscardin. For years, it remained my totem animal. On the outskirts of the forest, I sought out a nook for my lair. The entrance hole was not to be located on level ground. It would be better in a hollow trunk or a deft in a rock. From there, I began digging the tunnel a bit deeper each day. Scraping out the soil, I scattered it so that no trace remained. Once I got deep enough, I dug a second tunnel, which led upward as an escape route. With every entrance, you have to provide an exit. With every road, you have to think of the road back. That was already clear to me even then. The work had to be done quietly and prudently. From above, the sparrowhawk was a threat by day and the owl by night. On the ground, there were hostile creatures, especially the viper. A muscardine is always menaced. That is the tribute it pays to freedom. Once the tunnels were dug, I started the dwelling, a cozy chamber, not too small, not too big. It never occurred to me that there might also be a female, nor did I have to provide for my mother. She was omnipresent. She was the cavern itself. Once the chamber was set up and its oval smoothed out, I dug the tap tunnel to the storeroom. The latter was bigger and arched like a cake. With such a pantry there would be no want. Not to be forgotten was the toilet. The muscardine is praised for its cleanliness. It does not smell like other rodents, though in springtime it gives off a musky fragrance. During the winter, the toilet would fill up with black kernels. Here, too, I thought of not only the mouth but also the exit. After the construction, I went on to the furnishing. In a camp for mooning away the winter, the finest downs were just barely fine enough. I knew places where the selection had already been made, the nests of kitty wrens and marigold finches. I tracked them down whenever I heard the zzzz of the finches. That is their cry when their brood has taken wing. I had already spotted their nests while they were still building them. The muscardine climbs cautiously through the branches. Up there, I discovered the downs that the birds had plucked out, the tiny fibers that they had gathered in, and I took my tithe. On the edge of the woods, the clover dodder twines up in the nettles and scabious herbs. It deserves its German name, Cleeside, clover silk, for it forms cushions of silky soft threads that desiccate in early autumn. I knew how to harvest these too. I wove them into my lair and I added briar rose apples and hawthorn. I enjoy working. I held the fibers with my feet. I wove them with my hands and mouth. It was easy, though it took place in the dark. When fabrics are supple and feel pleasant, the work can become a game. The material pleasure turns into a spiritual one. That was my mood in the construction, and I became even more joyful when the first nuts were falling, with thuds that I could distinguish from all other sounds. It was a knocking, a heralding. That is my favorite kind of prophecy, not an empty promise, but a phenomenon, a small handsel, something material. I am like St. Thomas, show thy wounds, then I stand firm. Soon the nuts were falling en masse. When the wind blasted through the foliage, they sounded like hail. The nuthatches likewise tossed them down, Stymphalian birds with iron wings, swarms of them whirring in from the north, where they had spent the summer in the forests of the Yellow Khan. I raked in some of the abundance, carrying down the best nuts in my mouth, but always cautiously. Other fruits also stood me in good stead, the three-sided beechnut, the rosehip, the hawthorn, the rowanberry, and all kinds of seed grains. My storeroom was quickly filled, nor did I neglect my immediate rations, since the supplies you bring in your paunch are even more important for hibernation. Winter, we'll sleep you out. We are brimming with blossoming fat. Those are the words of a Roman poet who celebrated our life. A small dormouse's hunger is soon appeased. The imagination, by contrast, is insatiable. It feasts on the world's abundance. I enjoyed being with my provisions, a tiny cellarer with a crammed belly. I arranged my stores by types, piling them up. Let winter come, the harsher the better. I had planned ahead. When the leaves fell more densely, the outdoors became inhospitable. One morning the leaves were rimy. I re-examined my lair, tugging and twitching it aright. Then I stopped up the entrance with dry hay and also the exit, though less solidly. Now let the snow fall. The wolf season was beginning. I could lay myself to rest with drawn knees and a sunken head. My breath would not stir a feather. My heartbeat would be barely perceptible. I was the child in its mother's womb. Why could this not last forever? Why is it that my reveries stopped when I reached this point? A dream culminates. It grows too strong. We have to break off. We await the beloved. From far away we make out her vehicle among all the others. It stops outside the house, and now the game of doors commences. The door of the vehicle, of the garden, of the house. Now she is mounting the stairs. The final door is about to open. 19. Children's games are as disparate as their characters. Their playing foreshadows what they will do as men and women. The leitmotif recurs at every age, and that was what happened to me with the Muscardin and its refuge in Eumeswil. For that I have to go back a little. Even before the Condor shelled the harbour, one could sense the uneasiness that usually precedes such actions. There is a lot of talking and also whispering. People who used to barely exchange nods get together now and confer. In my janitor's home, too, there were meetings of people who, like him, hoped that the tribunes would hold out and who more or less had reasons for their hopes. They tried to raise each other's spirits. They heard more or less sensible things. I could judge them from my perspective as an anarch who, although personally indifferent to the whole business, found it fascinating as a historic issue. Moreover, I may have been the only person who was not afraid. I relished what I was listening to, like Stendhal on such an occasion. I appreciate him also as a historian. Now I am not putting down fear. It is a foundation of physicality, indeed of physics. If the ground wobbles or if the house so much as threatens to collapse, one looks for the door. This too creates a selection, say, of those people who did not fall into the trap. In this respect, Odysseus is one of our greatest models, the whiffer par excellence. Fear is primary, the instinctive whiffing of danger. It is joined by caution, then canniness, and also cunning. Odysseus's caution is so extraordinary because he also has courage and curiosity. He is the harbinger of Western man's intellect, boldness, and inquiring mind. Their fears demonstrated a better assessment of the situation than any words they uttered. The Condor was already the center invisible to his enemies, visible to his partisans. They clung together, from Cato the Younger to the traitor Ganelon. The Condor dictated their thoughts, then their movements. Should one adjust to him, or even fall in with him? On such eves a tyrant needs friends, but equally indispensable are enemies. Blood will flow, that is the consecration he cannot renounce. The populace expects it of him. There's the glutton, the gimp. Drag him on a hook, the patricide, throw him into the Tiber. And what about the prescription lists? Some people are more or less incriminated, but the fellow traveler will also be charged. Accusers who have kept silent develop an astounding sense of justice. Still, the very prospect of losing one's job is harsh, so you put up with a thing or two. The best job is a modest one, where you don't act big. But even here, the envious are not lacking, so they calculated their chances, weighed the issues of time and space. In cases of doubt, vanishing is advisable, even for one night. The absence can be drawn out. Meanwhile, water flows over the dam. Anyone can resurface eventually. Old friend, where have you been? We haven't seen you in ages. I've been living. Regarding a space, it is good to plan ahead during periods when there isn't a cloud in the sky. Several of my janitor's friends had relatives abroad. In those days, a bungalow on the northern edge of the Mediterranean was also popular. Another friend had made emergency arrangements with his girlfriend. There are women who kept a lover hidden for years behind a jib door or in a garret. He could take breathers at night. That was more or less how they thought and planned in the background while I rubbed my hands. Man is a rational being who does not like sacrificing his safety to theories. Placards come and go, but the wall they are pasted on endures. Theories and systems pass over us in the same way. Nothing phases you, my brother once said during one of our useless debates. I took it as a compliment. Incidentally, it was not as bad as they had expected, although it did not come off without violence. Every revolution demands blood. Not much more flowed than at bullfights. Naturally, prudence is always called for. There is a gap during which imponderables occur. For days and nights the underworld has a free hand. The new rulers do not interfere. These are shortcuts. They fit in with their plans. The Lebanese once said to me, "You know, When we got the first news of the terror, the time of flowery speeches was over. In a woodland near Nar el Kalb, they had found corpses that no one gave two hoots about, least of all the police. A clairvoyant was also killed. One-eyed people get off more easily. Almost everyone is feared for his job. Others, however, may look forward to being promoted out of turn. Accordingly, the denunciations swell. This also tends to happen when majorities succeed one another legally. They push their party men even into the tobacco shops. During an overthrow, one must also reckon with types who tell themselves it would be best if he never came back. The higher a predecessor stood, the deeper his fall and the more certain his death. But even the little fellow traveller out in the suburbs is threatened with a settling of accounts. He pays for his daily bread a second time. There are strata that abut on the magma, becoming too hot for the historian, too dense. Perhaps that is the source of my disgust at the obtuse reiteration of events. If a Shakespeare has mastered the material, then that should suffice once and for all. We should act either instinctively like animals or reasonably like cerebral beings. In that case, there would be no remorse. Here in Eumeswil, the soil is too leached out to put forth a St. Bartholomew's night or a Sicilian Vespers. The ground can only nourish infamy. On the other hand, one must consider liquidation through administrative channels. This is taken care of quite dispassionately, cosily, by bureaucrats sitting on their behinds in their offices, frequently types who cannot even watch a chicken being slaughtered. These views are partly retrospect, partly prospect. Remission is what the doctors call the temporary abatement of an illness. However, the body remains susceptible. For now there seems little to fear. The domo even exaggerates the judicature. This too is a suspicious symptom. Our model is not the courtroom but the traffic accident. A driver overlooks a stop sign or a right-of-way and burns up with 100 other people. My janitor and nearly all his friends actually kept their jobs. Only my brother was slightly plucked. Soon they were sitting together again as the 7 upright men. Incidentally, I noticed that our professors, trying to show off to their students, rant and rail against the state and against law and order, while expecting that same state to punctually pay their salaries, pensions and family allowances, so that they value at least this kind of law and order. Make a fist with the left hand and open the right hand receptively. That is how one gets through life. This was easier under the tribunes. It is also one reason for my dear brother's nostalgia for their splendor. Yet he himself helped to saw off their branch. The condor feels like and presents himself as a tyrant. This entails fewer lies. For me, nothing basic has changed. My character, that of an Anak, remains intact. For the historian, the yield is actually richer in that it becomes more vivid. The political trend is always to be observed, partly as a spectacle, partly for one's own safety. The liberal is dissatisfied with every regime. The Anak passes through their sequence as inoffensively as possible, like a suite of rooms. This is the recipe for anyone who cares more about the substance of the world than its shadow, the philosopher, the artist, the believer. In this respect, I feel that the Jews were wrong when they refused to hail Caesar. Saluting was purely a question of form. To be sure, one must overcome one's inner resistance before agreeing to something. At first, as after every change of regime, there was a period of fair weather, even a certain upsurge due to reforms, new brooms sweep clean. Then came disturbances of a mostly personal nature. I will return to this when discussing capital punishment. It was in the city, and not in the Kasbah, that I sensed I might get involved in the turmoil. At the Institute, I was viewed with greater reserve. They grew more reticent with me in conversations, though almost imperceptibly. Such caution is heralded by a lessening of candor, the emergence of taboos. Thus, in my presence, they avoided any allusion, even humorous ones, to the ruler, or if they did venture to allude to him, it sounded forced. In the street, this was clearer. Unknown people who saw my phonophore turned away as if they had spotted something unpleasant. Others glared at me with unconcealed repulsion. The phonophore is generally carried in such a way that its edge sticks out of the left breast pocket. The classes are marked on it. If we can even speak of classes here, They are of a potential and dynamic nature. Equality and distinctions of the ahistorical masses are reduced to motion. The social function is mechanically encoded and integrated in the hierarchy. The condor controls the monopoly on addressing the people, and he doles out the opportunities as he sees fit. The phonophore guarantees what the Jacobins strove for as an ideal, the perpetual forum, deliberation en permanence. Rarely is the gold phonophore seen. Its carriers seldom walk in the city. My silver phonophore, of course, is merely that of a minor trabant, but notable insofar as it is attached to the red network. This has its pluses and minuses. I can be mustered as an auxiliary policeman at any time. Changes in profound strata announce themselves on the surface as delicate ripples. One becomes sensitive to variations in the weather. Perhaps the temperature has dipped 1/10 of a degree. It is not pleasant when a group of acquaintances obviously change the subject the instant one enters. Back then, I noticed that in certain places or on certain occasions, I would cover my phonophore with the flap of my breast pocket. At first, this was purely a reflex action, yet it was already the beginning of a camouflage. A short time later, I pondered my safety. It might become advisable for me to withdraw from society for an indefinite period. This does not mean that I was thinking of simply deserting. Such a démarche would flout my rules. A game, whether one starts out with white or with black, is played to its end. This end was, no doubt, considered by the condor, and that was why his instructions ignored the possibility of a rear assault on the duck shack. The tyrant wishes to remain true to himself, and to that extent he can count on me. This loyalty is not to be understood as vassalage. It is a question of personal integrity. 20. There was something appealing about the prospect of taking a complete holiday from society and being my own master for a while. I even had to avoid wishing for the catastrophe, much less promoting it with my limited powers. This would not have been altogether far-fetched. Carnevale. This madness breaks out even when a year draws to its dose, not to mention a millennium. Now it was time to locate a place for my molting, which brings me back to the Muscadin. The mouth of the Sus is shallow and sprawling. Sandbanks emerge at low tide. Troops of flamingos gather on them, and also herons, bitterns, ducks, ibises, and cormorants. In short, the delta is transmuted into an avian paradise. The hunters, fowlers, fishermen, and naturally also ornithologists like Rosner feel fine there. Rosner sits on the shore in front of his flock of birds, observing them while keeping his journal and banding the feet of those he catches. Occasionally I accompany him, either for pleasure, since this is a life as in the Garden of Eden, or in a semi-official capacity when the Yellow Khan is about to visit and the great hunts have to be prepared. The falconers then train their birds to seize, the hunters train their hounds to fetch. That was where I began my reconnoitering. No one notices if you move about with a bird gun and provisions. Reed jungles spread out just above the estuary. They would be impenetrable if animals had not beaten their trails, shadowy corridors in the elephant grass. Going through them is dangerous. I may have to dodge into the rushes at any moment, especially at dawn or dusk. Also, prior to every step, I have to test where to set foot. Then again, I scarcely have to worry about being followed. Further upstream, the reeds become sparse, the swamp becomes treacherous. Most treacherous of all are the alluvial sandbanks deposited by the high tides. Even if you sink only knee-deep, you are doomed. The tide has left sloughs and basins enjoyed by the reptiles. It took me a long time to mark out a safe path. In the midst of this labyrinth, a flat cap swells up, scarcely larger than a medium-sized golf course. Not even a bushman would dream of venturing to the top, for it is densely overrun with a copse of hand-long thorns, Acacia borida. A slope for shrikes. In order to reach the peak, I had to slash a path for myself. At the top, a surprise was waiting. As a historian, I have to deal with the geomantic power that imbues many places, especially hills. It is primarily of a material, physical nature. That is the source of its strength. Every nook harbors a cave. Novalis. The bosom is the chest risen to the rank of mystery. That is good. From the rank of mystery would be even clearer. My model was Lugdanum, a Gallic city that I care about. a stronghold and sanctuary for tribes and nations that followed one another from the days of those whom the archaeologists puzzle about until the tourist swarms of the third Christian millennium. It would all fill more than one book. Roland, too, resided there, a hill visible far and away, also commanding far and away. The cathedral was built from its stone. The rock rose from the rank of mystery. Under its foundations, crypts and catacombs, there mystery dwells more densely than above, in the forest of columns. I had to think of it when, scratched by thorns and punctured by mosquitoes, I reached the crest of the hill. Historically, this coast has always lain in shadow, under foreign masters who carved it up into provinces and colonies or retreated here during civil warfare. Mauritanian earth. Soldiers have fought on it with horses, camels and elephants, with chariots and tanks. This hill offered itself to anybody who wanted to survey the lowland all the way to the sea and beyond the river. The last time must have been after the Second World War, that is, after the final triumph of the technician over the warrior. Just as flames keep blazing on the edges after vast conflagrations, isolated feuds keep going after peace treaties. Such feuds rarely leave names or dates behind. For the historian, these are dry spells which at best constitute oddities, and even these are mostly repulsive. One advantage of the Luminar is that, quick as lightning, you can pick out details from huge old tomes, such as History of the Medieval City of Rome. Up here, a sultan must have planned a fortified lookout, a bunker whose crenellations were all that loomed from the ground. The place had been completed but obviously never used, for concrete mixers and other equipment had not been cleared away. They were rusting in the bushes. The bunker had a green dome. The acacias had seeded it long ago. No pilot, however low he flew, would get suspicious. Smoke, of course, must not rise during the day. Thus, I had already taken possession of this place, and at first glance to boot. It struck me as quite favorable for the forest flight, even over a longer period. A hole led down to it. I slipped in after using a candle to test for gases and a Geiger counter for radiation. The door was armored and still intact. A few drops of oil would be necessary. The interior, designed for a commando team, was neither too large for me nor too small. This reconnoitering launched a year-long labor on which, thorny as it was, I look back fondly. The planning occupied my leisure hours in the Kasbah. The execution filled out my free time and a long vacation. The task was simple, the performance complicated. The chief reason was that I treated it as a game. As everyone knows, we devote far more zeal to such games than to any breadwinning. This applies, say, to fishing, riding, playing ball, putting up a bungalow, and to all diversions and collections. For thousands of years, warfare, hunting, horses, theatre, and splendid buildings were regarded as princely pastimes. Technology put an end to that. We observed that at the very latest, since the invention of gunpowder, the warrior accepted the more effective weapon only reluctantly because it spoiled his fun. The problem I had to solve boils down to a simple formula. How does one make oneself invisible for a while? This was not only my personal concern. In Eumeswil, everyone thinks about this more or less earnestly. These are thoughts that occur automatically during a civil war. They hover in the air, are dictated by atmospheric conditions. A palace revolution, a military revolt are possible at any time. One morning, occupiers can knock on your door. If you stand out even slightly, your name will be on a list. The police have developed a great cunning along these lines, and some private individuals even maintain files. One cannot be cautious enough. The participation in certain processions and assemblies, the refusal to perform certain tasks, to accept certain honors, indeed to employ certain forms of greeting, are discerned in a seemingly inattentive way or even with liberal benevolence. But, as Thofern once put it, these things are not only noticed, but also noted down. There is a hole in the card, and the system of these punchings sketches what is known as conviction. I endeavor to have no conviction, and so my dear brother regards me as lacking conviction. Being free of conviction would, of course, be the better term. I set great store not by conviction, but by a free disposition of myself. Thus, I am at someone's disposal to the extent that I am challenged, whether to love or to war. I value not the conviction, but the man. Je regarde et je garde. From a remark made by the Domo at the night bar, I gathered that he maintains a register of the subscribers to the Wren. This Wren is, albeit to a rather modest degree, the opposition gazette of Eumeswil. It is tolerated, though not according to the motto of a weak Prussian king, I love an opposition with conviction. Presumably, however, the little gazette owes its existence precisely to that official register, a touch of honey and the flies gather for the feast. The editors venture out only on tiptoe, but under the circumstances even the subtlest hint has an effect. The ears become sharp enough to catch even the drop of a pin. Such gazettes live on an anonymous popularity. Everyone has read them. People refer to them sub rosa as if to a taboo. Napoleon III had a far more severe pursuer who hounded him with a journal, La Lanterne. The cover was printed in a cheap ink. It gave the readers rosy fingertips. Flaunting them was considered chic. Even the emperor would coyly show his. This explains why the Wren has a tiny subscription list despite its large circulation. People buy it at stands or from street vendors. So I was not caught unawares by the Domo's remark, I am on the alert. On a sloping plane, one deals more thoroughly with questions of personal safety. Nor am I different from anyone else. I began taking practical precautions when I noticed that passers-by were glaring at me. Ferreting out the bunker was the preparation. Then came the setting up. My goal was to find the best solution for vanishing as thoroughly as possible for an indefinite period, so I approached this problem in my own way, taking my time. When society involves the anarch in a conflict in which he does not participate inwardly, it challenges him to launch an opposition. He will try to turn the lever with which society moves him. Society is then at his disposal, say, as a stage for grand spectacles that are devised for him. If he is a historian, history becomes a presence for him. Everything changes. The fetter becomes fascinating, danger and adventure, a suspenseful task. In my case, flight was transformed into the luxury of solitude. Living as a monk in a cell, as a poet in a garret, as Robinson Crusoe on his island. Everyone has had those dreams. For me it was the muscardin, the totem animal of my childhood, that revived in my memory. When we have to make a dream come true, we spare no effort. And that was what happened here. 21. In order to describe these efforts, I would have to ramble on and on. Let me therefore content myself with the preliminary arrangements. Others could benefit from this, for it is a general problem. A year's provisions plus extensive equipment had to be hauled inconspicuously through swamp and thicket, a task that seemed almost insurmountable for a lone man, yet it had to be performed without assistance. If even one person knew about it, then the security would be questionable from the very start. The site itself offered a number of resources. Since I could expect to find the concrete depressing, I covered the walls and the ceiling with the bamboo-like reeds that proliferated in between the acacias. The deep yellow color of the canes was pleasant, almost orange. Aside from that, I would be spending most of the day outdoors. The bushes shielded me from prying eyes. Still, their feathery foliage was so sparse that enough rays came through for sunbathing. The bed was taken care of with the help of moss and half a grass. But now for the transport from the city. If an enterprise is to be concealed from society, there is a proven method. You secrete it in some undertaking that society approves of, indeed regards as commendable. For example, a father is pleased to see his son studying the Bible. His pleasure would vanish if he realized that this zeal is focused solely on tracking down the risque passages, or a master spy sets up a photography shop and so forth. As for me, ornithology came to my aid. I camouflaged myself as a bird watcher. Rosner was delighted. I gave him the wording for the appropriate instructions. There are still a few birds left that are little known to scholars or even new for them. Thus, just recently, some of the Yellow Khan's hunters discovered a forest peacock beyond the desert. Rosner had a similar windfall on the Upper Sus when he tracked down a breed of chicken whose nearest kin live in the Australian bush, a creature with bizarre habits. He said, "This creature invented the incubator long before the Egyptians hit upon it." There is simply nothing new in the cosmos, otherwise the universe would not deserve its name. This fowl assigns its incubating to the elements by piling up mounds of foliage where it conceals its eggs. The warmth caused by fermentation does the hatching. The bird only has to make sure that the heat is kept within the right limits. For this, the moisture must be regulated. To capture water, the bird hollows out the top of the mound during rainfall and covers this cavity in sunshine. In so doing, the bird knows how to prevent the interior from getting too warm. It thereby also anticipated the thermostat. All in all, we may assume that our intelligence is nothing but a reduced instinct, a branching off from the tree of life with a selection process that has been intensifying for thousands of years. This conjecture is not new, but with the decay of history, metahistorically that is, it takes on new meaning. Among other things, the animals could demand from us the same sacrifices that we have inflicted on them. On this basis, we can judge the banality of the savants who wrestle with the question of whether animals have intelligence. In its own way, this bird can also function as a model for a familial problem, insofar, that is, as only the male works. The male is distinguished by his feet, powerful scrapers that tirelessly rake the leaves together. It is only when the wattles swell on his naked throat that the female appears for mating. After ceremonial bowing and dancing, she lets him tread her, and then she lays eggs in the nest. It is the husband who looks after the eggs until they hatch. The chicks then flutter off like quail and are able to perch on trees during the very first night. Rosner regarded this enrichment of our fauna as a sensation. He drew up a catalogue of questions. The remoteness of the habitat was probably the cause of this atypical behavior. For me as a historian, this raised matriarchal issues. I summoned Bachofen to the Luminar. We got into a lively conversation. It automatically followed that I offered to observe the fowl in my free time. Rosner praised my zeal. The condor himself was informed about it and vouchsafed me an appreciative word as he left the night bar. This solved the transport problem. The biotope had a favorable, almost inaccessible location. The entrance to the acacia thicket lay nearby. That was where I rigged up my lookout post. It was obvious that the job, with interruptions, would take at least one season. There was no great distinction between setting up this stand and what I was planning for my bunker. Anything I needed was driven down to Rosner's flocks of birds on the lower Sus and then lugged on muleback through the elephant grass. There the porters built my shack. Once they left, the actual labor began. I brought the stuff for the bunker up through the acacias. For this, I kept one mule. To enable the animal to squeeze through, I had to widen the access trail. This did not bother me, for acacias grow quickly. Soon after moving in, I would be as snugly cocooned as in Sleeping Beauty's castle. The shack for observing the scraper chicken had roughly the same significance for me as the pressure chamber for a diver. He pauses there with his equipment before venturing down to a new depth. The shack also had a political advantage, that of a relay station. Whenever trouble might be brewing in Eumeswil, I could plausibly retreat to the shack and eventually go home in fairer weather. I would then have worked for Rosner. If things changed, I would move to the hermitage. First, I would become less visible. Then, I would become invisible. Rosner, incidentally, was not short-changed. I had enough free time for observing his scraper fowl. I used the mounds for concealing small apparatuses to register the temperature at various levels, and I set up others to record the clucking of the mating call. One of the things I observed was that the fowl has a nasty enemy in the wild dog. I managed to shoot a few of them. Their presence alone makes the region appear unsafe. Above all, I could confirm that this fowl was in fact a new breed. Rosner was enraptured. He absolutely insisted on naming it after me, Alectura venatoris. I had a hard time dissuading him. After all, despite everything, I had tricked the good man. However, one of the Anarch's emoluments is that he is distinguished for things that he has done on the side or that go against his grain. Needless to say, I took weapons along to the bird stand. Not only did I have to catch birds for Rosner's museum, but I also had to protect myself against predators and big game, especially the red buffalo, a highly dangerous creature that pops up unexpectedly. I therefore armed myself with hunting and military weapons. The Anarch wages his own wars, even when marching in rank and file. For the shotguns, I stocked up on ammunition from birdshot to buckshot, plus hollow bodies for short-distance shooting. As for my rifle, I needed to fire bullets without cartridges. Unedo brand. One's enough. A man who wears the silver phonophore does not need a gun permit. I purchased 2 identical sets of weapons in various shops. One set remained in the lower hut, the other was stored in the bunker. Thus, I was armed not only for defense, but also for hunting fresh meat. A large antelope, whose venison makes for excellent drying, crosses near the bunker. It provides meat for a year. Unbidden guests were scarcely to be feared, nevertheless they had to be taken into account. I cleared the final stretch of the acacia trail in a straight line. At night, I would replace the rifle's telescopic sight with a spotlight to shine on the intruder. The ray would be immediately followed by the shot. I would have heard the bloodhound before he entered the line of fire. In Eumeswil, fine acoustics has almost reached perfection. There are areas where one does not even dare whisper. You would be risking your life. Rather than lose myself in details, I merely wish to mention that I rejected mines from the very outset. One shouldn't even start with them, an experienced sapper once told me. This was thoroughly borne out by my study of guerrilla warfare. The mine, as the Russian says about the bullet, is a blind fool, a true Pandora's box even for the man who plants it. Aside from the earthquakes in our region, a mine can be set off by an animal's footstep, or it can blow up an innocent person. One's own forgetfulness can also be fatal. A mine is anonymous, a crude weapon. Partisans like using mines because of the peculiar nature of their struggle, which makes the landscape uncertain. The Anarch is not tempted by them, if only because he is oriented to facts, not ideas. He fights alone as a free man and would never dream of sacrificing himself to having one inadequacy supplant another and a new regime triumph over the old one. In this sense, he is closer to the Philistine, the baker whose chief concern is to bake good bread, the peasant who works his plough while armies march across his fields. The Anarch is a forest fleer, the partisans are a collective. I have observed their quarrels as both a historian and a contemporary, stuffy air, unclear ideas, lethal energy, which ultimately put abdicated monarchs and retired generals back in the saddle, and they then show their gratitude by liquidating those self-same partisans. I had to love certain ones, because they loved freedom, even though the cause did not deserve their sacrifice. This made me sad. If I love freedom above all else, then any commitment becomes a metaphor, a symbol. This touches on the difference between the forest fleer and the partisan. This distinction is not qualitative but essential in nature. The Anarch is closer to being. The partisan moves within the social or national party structure. The Anarch is outside it. Of course, the Anarch cannot elude the party structure since he lives in society. The difference will be obvious when I go to my forest shack while my Lebanese joins the partisans. I will then not only hold on to my essential freedom, but also gain its full and visible enjoyment. The Lebanese, by contrast, will shift only within society. He will become dependent on a different group, which will get an even tighter hold on him. Naturally, I could just as well or just as badly serve the partisans rather than the condor, a notion I have toyed with. Either way, I remain the same, inwardly untouched. It makes no difference that it is more dangerous siding with the partisans than with the tyrant. I love danger, but as a historian I want danger to stand out sharply. Murder and treason, pillage, fire and vendetta are of scant interest for the historian. They render long stretches of history, say Corsican, unfruitful. Tribal history becomes significant only when, as in the Teutoburger Wald, it manifests itself as world history. Then names and dates shine. The partisan operates on the margins. He serves the great powers which arm him with weapons and slogans. Soon after the victory, he becomes a nuisance. Should he decide to maintain the role of idealist, he is made to see reason. In Eumeswil, where ideas vegetate, the process is even more wretched. As soon as a group has coalesced, one of the 12 is bound to consider betrayal. He is then killed, often merely on suspicion. At the night bar, I heard the Domo mention such a case to the Condor. "He could have gotten off more cheaply with us," he commented. "Muddleheads. I'll take the gangsters any time. They know their business." I entered this in my notebook. In conclusion, I would like to repeat that I do not fancy myself as anything special for being an Anak. My emotions are no different from those of the average man. Perhaps I have pondered this relationship a bit more carefully and am conscious of a freedom to which basically everybody is entitled, a freedom that more or less dictates his actions. The most important consideration was water. This was hardly a problem. Any bunker in our area was built with a sloping roof, which fed a cistern during the rainy season. I cannot rely on that, however, since the surface of the roof has long since been overgrown. Luckily, a bend in the Sus is located nearby. The marshes do dry out in the summer, but scattered pools always remain full. Moreover, fish and turtles survive in them. These pools are unapproachable from the river. The quicksand in between does not bear the slightest weight. And so, pushing first through the acacias once more and then through the reeds, I will break a path which can also serve as an escape route. That is to be my initial task. It will provide access to water. Nor will there be any lack of wine. I have put in a large supply, at least 1 bottle per day. I must remark, however, that our local wine is very strong. The vines creep over the hot earth, producing true Caleb grapes. I am familiar with the vintages. As steward, I join in the tastings prior to every purchase for the Kasbah. As I have mentioned, I plan to live chiefly by hunting. For this reason, I had to obtain salt and pepper as well as other spices. Our cooks have a spice for almost every roast. Nor will I lack vegetables. I have brought up a stock of seeds. Lettuce, radishes, a type of climbing bean, grow amazingly fast here. I have also planted several clusters of cassava. They propagate without your even glancing at them. Tea, coffee, chocolate are packed in airtight containers. They could be deposited in mummy tombs, and future archaeologists would be delighted. Cane sugar and maple syrup, crystallized honey for tea. Vessels, first my silver goblet. I will not bring it until my final trip. Flatware, not to mention the corkscrew, then everything required for cooking and roasting. 1 pot suffices, the kind that the Arab women use here, and that would have pleased Rumor, the gastrosopher. They assemble it out of perforated components, which they fill up with various kinds of meat, as well as millet, greens, legumes, and tubers. The ingredients enrich one another almost alchemically. Though there is plenty of dry wood lying about up there, I plan to avoid building fires because of the smoke. Heating has not been a problem since the invention of the thermal rings. The device, which produces any degree of warmth up to white heat, was a relatively recent development. The rings are expensive. Possession of the silver phonophore is a prerequisite for buying them. Supposedly, further surprises can be expected from the catacombs. So much for provisions. I could elaborate. Any reader would find this itemization long-winded, and rightly so. I got lost in a fantasy game, as I had done in my Muscardin role in the attic. Only this time I was closer to reality. I could, if I wanted to, make the dream come true. The same holds for my jottings. They suffice for attesting to my freedom in soliloquy. Diversions are the least of my problems, since my nature is such that I never get bored. As a child, in order to enjoy myself, I had to retreat to the most out-of-the-way nooks. Today, this is no longer required. Bruno helped me in this respect too. Let me briefly add the following. The view that external things like rank, money, and honors bring happiness has frequently been criticized, but it is not necessarily incorrect. After all, these things belong, as Aquinas would have it, among the accidents. Accidens is the unessential, which includes the body. If one manages to separate essence from flesh, if one manages, that is, to gain distance from oneself, then one climbs the first step towards spiritual power. Many exercises are geared to this, from the soldier's drill to the hermit's meditation. However, once the self has been successfully distanced, the essential can be brought back to the accidental. This process, resembling a vaccination with one's own blood, is initially manifested as a reanimation of the body. The physiognomy takes on the kind of features seen in paintings by old masters. They added something of their own. They blended it into the pigments. This also applies to objects. They were meaningful, now they gain a sense. A new light shines on things, they glow. Anyone can manage this. I heard the following from a disciple of Bruno's. The world seemed hollow to me because my head was hollow. But the head too can be filled. First we must forget what we have learned. On this score I am still a novice. The goal also leads beyond Bruno. Could I expel the magic from my path? But ennui is banished. The play has not yet begun. The musicians are tuning their instruments. There seems to be a stirring behind the curtain. In front of the mirror, I practice the removal of myself. Its return, however, that is the problem. Up in the bunker, I will also have time for fishing and hunting. There will even be notes for Rosner. During my first exploratory outing, I had noticed an acacia. It grew in the type of clearing that emerges when a tree collapses. The bush, like a gallows, was hung with skeletons. Although the skeletons were small, I recoiled at first glance. This sometimes happens to us when we unexpectedly stumble on nature's cruelty. Rosner views this as resentment. He compares nature to a festive kitchen where everyone both consumes and is consumed. Nothing perishes. The equation works out. Everything fertilizes everything else, as the farmers say. If I am to believe Rosner, we live partly on the beings that we produce in our innards in order to digest them. That is how one might picture the demiurge, up there as a world spirit with Olympian serenity, delighting in the raging of animals and the warring of men, down here as a pot-bellied man who benefits from every consuming and from every being consumed. This, of course, releases me from pain as little as it does the grenadier whose leg is shot off for the greater glory of the king. As an anarch, I also have to steer clear of martyrdom, and for the historian, the issue of pain is fundamental. Incidentally, the historian must avoid not only the biological or the economic reading of history, but also the philosophical. His scholarship aims at the human. History, like man, can be neither explicated nor sublimated. Look into your own eye. The skeletons on the gallows were those of birds, frogs, and lizards. The birds must have been the size of unfledged to full-grown sparrows. This was plainly a shrike's hunting ground. The shrike is also popularly known as the nine-killer, nine-murderer, or butcher-bird. It lingers near thorn hedges, setting them up as pantries. There it skewers any prey that it does not consume immediately. Whenever necessary, it returns in order to gulp down smaller animals at one bite or tear the flesh from the bones of larger ones, as I saw here at its Golgotha. A miniature image, but eerie. There is a lot to observe here. When the shrike brings its victims, are they dead or still alive? And how does it impale them? Presumably, like a good householder, it makes sure that they remain fresh as long as possible. Rosner knows of similar examples. A wasp, by stinging the ganglion, paralyzes its prey, a caterpillar that is to serve as food for the wasp's young. The victim can still chew. The maggots then live on it by skimming off its extra weight. Perhaps some little-known butcher-bird was at work here. Further down in the reeds, a huge kingfisher, the pied kingfisher, does its hunting. In these dimes, this bird is ubiquitous along our coasts and rivers and seldom timid. You can almost touch it with your hand. Once, when I was fishing on the Seuss, a bird holding a fish it had caught alighted next to me on a post and nodded at me. I would have nothing new to report on it, but that is not the point. Rosner knows infinitely more about these creatures than I do. But if I may go back to what I was saying, he limits himself to the accidents. Aside from a calendar in which I cross out the days, I will take no printed matter along. The prospect of a year in which the mind is utterly relieved of reading is pleasant. A temporary break from reading can be as beneficial to mental health as a fasting cure to physical health. The absence of the luminar will also be benign. Not only is the transformer stored in the rock under the Kasbah, but it could be moved only by truck. I will miss inquiry not as an anarch, but probably as a historian. Aside from rare conversations, as with Vigo, this magical and often brilliant evocation of time from the catacombs fills the only hours in which I am entirely devoted to my work. I have often wondered if it is the temporal distance that transforms events into history, but I would rather presume that this interval clarifies whatever is hidden as essence in the foam and froth. History then becomes a subject for the poet as well. On the other hand, Eumeswil, even should 1,000 years go by, can never become an object of history in this way. Eumeswil is without history, and expectations are therefore different. There is a paraplegia that slices through the nerve of history. It terminates tradition. The deeds of the fathers can survive only in spectacles or tragedies, but not in action. We must resign ourselves. This has been going on in Eumeswil for generations. To be sure, custodians have also survived here, dream-towners who convene as phantoms. Their séances bear a certain resemblance to those of the anarchists. They put flags on their regular tables and buy drinks for young men who make fun of them. Naturally, revolutions too can offer material for tradition. I recall one of those groups and its vapid idealism, the storm companions of Socrates. My dear brother introduced me there. For the historian, such phenomena are more ghostly than epigonic. Long periods are meagre, anemic, barren. Tradition is preserved wherever it bottoms out, gets to the bottom, that is, with its final stewards, and not where, as with the Western Caesars, it drowses away in a twilight state. Of the Eastern Caesars, the last one fell in the breach of the city wall. The great cities become transcendent in the flames. I am thinking of Hasdrubal's wife, a woman I venerated and loved. She preferred fire to submission. I have brought a small televisor up to the bunker. I will occasionally switch it on for news. The news is telecast towards sundown and generally received in such a way that an individual viewer cannot be spotted around this time. The supervision of the network is precise. Not only are partisan nests tracked down, but their planning is often followed in detail. It is incredible how frivolously young people with good backgrounds plunge into such adventures. Their imagination outsoars their intelligence. Though certainly bold enough to challenge society, they lack the know-how. That is why they always start out with the same mistakes. All the police need do is wait for them to fall into the trap. There is no hurry. Let it come to a head. This is one of the Domo's maxims that I hear in the night bar. I then prick up my ears. That is how deliberations in the cabinet end, yet a hint or two may be dropped in passing. The Upper Seuss is not considered a partisan area. Of that I can be certain. It would be highly unpleasant if dilettantes settled there, bringing the police down on me. As I have said, I have nothing to do with the partisans. I wish to defy society not in order to improve it, but to keep it at bay no matter what. I suspend my achievements, but also my demands. As for the do-gooders, I am familiar with the horrors that were perpetrated in the name of humanity, Christianity, progress. I have studied them. I do not know whether I am correctly quoting a Gallic thinker. Man is neither an animal nor an angel, but he becomes a devil when he tries to be an angel. Normally I will receive news through my transistor, but it might become necessary to confirm it with the televisor, say, in cases of doubt regarding the deaths of rulers or the lives of hostages. One must wait until the heads are displayed. Should anyone be missed, the search begins with an appeal through the phonophore. If a response follows, then one knows the man is still alive, and also roughly where he is, so I will keep the phonophore off for a long time. Our social existence is exhausted in switching and being switched. Its ideal is the switch to conformity. Incidentally, the way the discovery and utilization of electric power corresponds to social consciousness is a story unto itself. To find anything comparable, one must hark back to prehistory. That is one of the topics that Ingrid is working on, Franklin as a key figure. I have done some serious cogitating about the reasons for the failure of the forest flight. This issue haunts many people, indeed everyone who plans the perfect crime. Nearly all these types surrender to a misplaced optimism. The forest flight confirms the independence of the anarch, who is basically a forest fleer anywhere, anytime, whether in the thicket in the metropolis, whether inside or outside society. One must distinguish not only between the forest fleer and the partisan, but also between the anarch and the criminal. The difference lies in the relationship to the law. The partisan wants to change the law. the criminal break it. The anarch wants neither. He is not for or against the law. While not acknowledging the law, he does try to recognize it like the laws of nature, and he adjusts accordingly. When it is hot, you doff your hat. In rain, you open your umbrella. During an earthquake, you leave your house. Law and custom are becoming the subjects of a new field of learning. The anarch endeavors to judge them ethnographically, historically, and also, I will probably come back to this, morally. The state will be generally satisfied with him. It will scarcely notice him. In this respect, he bears a certain resemblance to the criminal, say the master spy, whose gifts are concealed behind a run-of-the-mill occupation. I assume that in great men whose names I dare not mention, the anarchic element was very powerful. You see, when fundamental changes are to succeed in law, custom, and society, they presuppose a great distancing from established principles. And the anarch, should he take any action, is capable of working this lever. I have summoned a few of the great movers and shakers to the luminar in order to look behind the revolutionary facade, less by delving into their private lives than by tracking down their intellectual foundations. Things that are spoken and noticed peripherally, unintentionally without slogans, are often more revealing than the program itself. Greatness is secondary for the anarch, often fortuitous. This explains why these great men considered their own achievements inadequate or even repugnant. Last words, and so much to do. They do not like being pinned down. Such qualms are posthumously reflected in their followers. More and more new schools and sects that cite the master keep germinating. The forest fleer and the partisan are not, as I have said, to be confused with each other. The partisan fights in society, the forest fleer alone. Nor, on the other hand, is the forest fleer to be confused with the anarch, although the two of them grow very similar for a while and are barely to be distinguished in existential terms. The difference is that the forest fleer has been expelled from society, while the anarch has expelled society from himself. He is and remains his own master in all circumstances. When he decides to flee to the forest, his decision is less an issue of justice and conscience for him than a traffic accident. He changes camouflage. Of course, his alien status is more obvious in the forest flight, thereby becoming the weaker form, though perhaps indispensable. Needless to say, I thoroughly studied these issues in the Luminar and at the library. Here I stumbled on the possibility of an error in the other direction. Let me quote a sentence I found in the introduction to an ancient work on Germanic pre- and proto-history. A certain Professor Kiekerbusch wrote, "To live as a serving link in the whole is both a duty and a reward. The supreme goal of every individual's labor and striving is the good of the collective." This is in the style of the eschaton of the warring nations, when exploitation changed its face. A few generations earlier, during the wars of liberation, this would have been expressed in a more fiery manner. The spirit passes over the flesh like a wind that keeps moving new generations. Enthusiasm follows it and vanishes after it. In Eumeswil, such statements have long since become so historical as to be rarely quoted in seminars. For the anarch, things are not so simple, especially when he has a background in history. If he remains free of being ruled, whether by sovereigns or by society, this does not mean that he refuses to serve in any way. In general, he serves no worse than anyone else, and sometimes even better, if he likes the game. He only holds back from the pledge, the sacrifice, the ultimate devotion. These are issues of metaphysical integrity, which have little clout in Eumeswil. By the same token, one does not chit-chat with men who think there is plenty of room for improvement here, or who actually promise you a heaven on earth. I serve in the Kasbah. If, while so doing, I died for the condor, it would be an accident, perhaps even an obliging gesture, but nothing more. I will allow myself a glance, albeit brief, at the weather. Every born historian knows the terror sparked by facts that, while traditional in their breadth, have become senseless. Just why did they sacrifice themselves? This can extend to man's conception of the world. Sir Richard Burton, the great traveller, wrote, How life is dim, unreal, vain, like scenes that round the drunkard reel, a drop in ocean's boundless tide, unfathomed waste of agony, where millions live their horrid lives by making other millions die. There is a degree of senselessness and glaciation that, in terrifying the eye, brings out contrast. Reality becomes suspect, and so phantoms draw nearer. This may be why the sight of a skeleton dismays us in a more precise manner than the sight of a corpse. The same holds true for purely mathematical conceptions of the world. This effect was the basis for a school that can be looked up in art history under the name of Surrealism. It flourished shortly before the first lunar landing. A house is not just untenanted, it has also died out, petrifying into the sarcophagus of the mind, the mausoleum of a charred world. No mortal emerges from the doorway. A volcano can be regarded as extinct since time immemorial. The very first neighboring inhabitants viewed it as dead. Yet if an eruption is in the making, the atmosphere turns sinister. This is sensed by few people in Eumeswil. The forest flight resembles the perfect crime in both its planning and its failures. Nothing is easier than opting for autonomy. Nothing is harder than bringing it about. Man has forgotten how to stand for himself on his own 2 feet, which grasp the ground directly. He does not like doing without helpers and accomplices. They introduce the first cracks into the system. The longest forest flight in Iceland was carried out by Grettir, the strongest man on the island. He feared no human being, but he did fear ghosts. When Gudmund advised him to settle on an untakeable cliff, Grettir replied, "I will try, but I am so scared of the dark that I cannot be alone for the life of me." To which Gudmund rejoined, "That may be true, but trust no one as much as yourself." Grettir took along his 15-year-old brother Illugi, and that was good, but he also took along Glaum, his slave. Illugi perished at his side while Glaum betrayed him. I have put up a memorial to Illugi on the Acacia Hill. Here in the south, the unhoused have also made a name for themselves, islanders like those of the north, and similarly shepherds and killers. The shepherd is bolder and freer than the cowherd. He is less tied to the soil. He grazes the wastelands. The plough, the yoke, the fence, the house were invented by the cowherd and are thus degrees of servitude and profit. These are phenomena. Behind them are the great signs of the ram and the bull. Such observations are useless in a city where people can no longer distinguish between ground and cause. The cause has a ground, but the ground no cause. The cause explains, while the ground is grounded on the unfathomable, but all this merely in passing. Whenever I was at the Luminar to follow the destinies of Corsican and Sardinian brigands, say Atandedu, forest dwellers who often kept a huge throng of policemen at bay for an astonishingly long time, I found that nearly all of them were doomed by a woman. Not that they were betrayed by her like Samson, but simply because of her complicity. The woman, usually the only person who knows the location of his hideout, steals up to her spouse or lover. Eventually the gendarmes with their hounds succeed in following her trail, and the game is up. Thus, I had my reasons for not letting Ingrid in on my plans. After all, we were often seen together in the city and at the institute, and she is no doubt mentioned as a contact in my file at the Kasbah. Granted, I can count on her silence, but what does that mean? In the end, the police only need to know that someone knows something, and then they are fully informed. Whenever tyranny is discussed, the word torture automatically springs up. There is no question of torture in Eumeswil. The police are much too good for that, which to be sure does not mean good-natured. They are obliged to work with gloves, which on the other hand does not mean kid gloves. Their grip has to be firm but not too harsh. Their response, to quote the Domo, must fit the provocation. This implies that, as people used to put it, blood should not stain the land. When I stand behind the bar, usually waiting rather than waiting on, I have plenty of time to observe the Domo. He is incapable of brutalities. He is not nervous, but he does have fine nerves. The motions of service are to blend harmoniously. The minions in particular are trained along these lines. If noises or voices displease him, his face sharpens imperceptibly. I have studied the engrams. He particularly seems to dislike the baying of hounds outside the Kasbah on moonlit nights. So when he puts his red eye on the margin of a file in case an interrogation has to be repeated, this does not indicate secret horrors. On the contrary, the more important a matter, the more pleasant the style of the proceedings. Occasionally, a fat military judge pops up in the night bar and sits cozily with the defendant, making sure, if I understand correctly, to keep the mood within certain limits. It is common knowledge, though not shouted from the rooftops, that severe torture is still or again being practiced in the territories of the Yellow Khan. Both the Condor and the Tribunes are discreet on this score, albeit with very different motives. In Eumeswil, the regime is tyrannical but not despotic. The despot enjoys degrading people. It is innate in him. He therefore acts on this instinct even beyond raison d'etat and his own advantage, judging by deeds that are constantly tried in courts here. I conclude that this instinct occurs in an especially pure form in certain regions, but is not regionally limited. Young men accost a passerby at night, overpower him, and take him to a lonely place. There they start torturing him and eventually kill him, although the victim has done them no harm and they do not even know him, yet that intensifies their rage. Such attacks do not occur at the waterfront, where bloody fistfights break out every night. They take place in the neighborhoods of the prominent citizens and for the pleasure of their offspring. There is also such a thing as a deluxe criminality, an art for art's sake. Grounds, says Vigo, are merely the skin on the groundless. So if I keep my secret to myself, I do so partly for safety's sake and partly because I do not want to burden anyone else. Ingrid knows only that should I disappear, she might receive a call from me. She is familiar with the bird shack to which I would summon her, but not the acacia grove. That is where my own domain actually begins. I do not intend to stir for another 6 months. My phonophore is switched on for reception only during the quarter hour of news. This measure, too, is prompted solely by caution, for I am not curious, since the politics in Eumeswil cannot possibly improve. Living without a woman for 6 months should not be difficult. In the Kasbah we are trained along these lines. I have noticed that dreams are not only refined, but also more vivid if a man puts restraints on himself. The coins of the realm are exchanged for gold. This is not meant to sound ungallant. Basically, am a small fish here, though perhaps a ground fish, a trabant in the tyrant's retinue, like almost everyone in this city. Strictly speaking, there are only tyrants today. Their methods of padding their cudgels differ only in color but not in cloth. Their similarities, down to their choice of words, show that of the 3 great principles equality has triumphed. Freedom was consumed for the sake of equality. The tyrant is the equalizer. Everyone recognizes himself in him. Fraternity means that the father no longer sacrifices the sons. Instead, the brothers kill one another. Wars between nations have been replaced by civil war. The great settling of accounts, first under national pretexts, led to a rapidly escalating world civil war. All that is behind us. We play it through in dreamlike repetitions because nothing better occurs to us, but also, though this applies only to certain individuals, we are waiting. Why am I, as a small fish, a groundling, going to all this trouble? It would probably suffice to take refuge with Pater Peccavi, my genitor, who, together with a dozen deceased or still living nullities, would be hailed as a luminary of scholarship. Incidentally, most revolutionaries suffer from not having become professors. The Domo knows this too. Once at the night bar, I heard him telling the Condor, "We'll make him a professor. That should take him off our backs." So why then all the trouble? My safety does not demand it. On the contrary, I find that danger actually makes life here bearable. Hence the thriving of crimes, addictions, the lottery. I prefer getting out when things grow boring, not dangerous. If I play the Condor's game to the very end, it is not because I am bound by any vassalage or allegiance, much less any party loyalty. It is really my own integrity. That is why I become more reliable in the endgame. I regard a change of power as an intermezzo. 2 forms of domination, of whose inadequacy I am convinced spell each other. I thereby enjoy a recess that clarifies the very fact that I am taking a recess. If I live on the hilltop like Robinson Crusoe on his island, I will be no freer than the man serving in the night bar, and I am no more autonomous as a doer than as a historian. However, things become more palpable in the doing. Inner freedom is demonstrated. Perhaps I will start by bringing about a private canny in front of the duck shack. 22. The anarch differs from the anarchist in that he has a very pronounced sense of rules. Insofar as and to the extent that he observes them, he feels exempt from thinking. This is consistent with normal behavior. Everyone who boards a train rolls over bridges and through tunnels that engineers have devised for him and on which 100,000 hands have labored. This does not darken the passenger's mood. Settling in comfortably, he buries himself in his newspaper, has breakfast, or thinks about his business. Likewise the anarch, except that he always remains aware of the relationship, never losing sight of his main theme, freedom, that which also flies outside, past hill and dale. He can get away at any time, not just from the train, but also from any demand made on him by state, society, or church, and also from existence. He is free to donate existence to being, not for any pressing reasons, but just as he likes, whether out of exuberance or out of boredom. Why do so many people strive for the career of petty functionary? No doubt because they have a sensible notion of happiness. They know the rules and their taboos. They sit in their chairs while others file past with their wishes or tributes. Time flows by nonchalantly. You are already halfway to Tibet, plus the security. No state can do without minor officials, no matter how high the waves may surge. Of course, you have to keep a low profile. As a historian, I must acknowledge that there have been long stretches in history, especially prehistory, when the ride was so satisfying that there was little reason to get off. Things generally became unpleasant with monotheism. On a single track, there is no swerving aside. The palette becomes more meager. Equality is based, as we have seen, on the possibility that anyone can kill anyone else. This awareness alone is enough to help us see through the swaggering of the superpowers, or, as here in Eumeswil, to help the historian study human behavior. So much for equality. Freedom is based on the expansion of that maxim, on the anarch's awareness that he can kill himself. He carries this awareness around. It accompanies him like a shadow that he can conjure up. A leap from this bridge will set me free. That is more or less how I regard the care I am taking in the acacia forest. The anarch, as I have expounded elsewhere, is the pendant to the monarch. He is as sovereign as the monarch, and also freer, since he does not have to rule. The hilltop bulwark is the chapel of my freedom, whether or not I enter it. It will serve as my stronghold when I change into a warring power and obtain my freedom against the demands of society, my exact courage against their exactions. I began with the respect that the anarch shows toward the rules. Respectare as an intensive of respicere means to look back, think over, take into account. These are traffic laws. The anarchist resembles a pedestrian who refuses to acknowledge them and is promptly run down. Even a passport check is disastrous for him. I never saw a cheerful end, as far back as I can look into history. In contrast, I would assume that men who were blessed with happiness, Sulla, for example, were anarchs in disguise. Regarding in particular the rules for conduct during domestic unrest, I have mentioned only the case of an alarm while I am in the Kasbah. But the phonophore transmits the red alert in the city too. One must then expect unpredictable things, especially if the weapons have not yet been distributed. Sometimes I play similar scenes at the Luminar, say, from the history of the Caesars or the Russians before and after the revolution. I close the door, draw the curtains. I am in the abyss. Then I take over the role of the monarch, say, Nero, once he is notified that his bodyguards have left. This is one of the final omens. Now the palace becomes very lonesome, eerie. None of the friends, none of the powerful respond. Only a few freed slaves have remained. They hope he will put a swift end to it all. The Caesar is the person who can least conceal himself in this world. Strange how now, alone in the universe, he becomes similar to the anarch. Even though his mortal fear is breathing down his neck, he manages to get out a few significant asides. Even as the hoofbeat announces the arrival of pursuers, he quotes the appropriate Homeric verse, thundering into my ear, and then the brilliant Qualis artifex pareo. What a great artist perishes with me. He is too weak, too clumsy to stab himself. His secretary, Epaphroditus, guides his hand. Incidentally, that was why Domitian had this benefactor executed. I would like to avoid getting mixed up in such quarrels by hearing, say, the condor tell me, "That is loyalty," as Nero told the centurion whose behavior was dubious. In case the alarm is sounded while I am in the city instead of the citadel, things will be easier, and not only because I can retreat to my own citadel whenever I like, I will also have less to think about since I will find sealed orders, namely at the central bank. There the envelope is kept for me in a safe deposit box. My phonophore contains the encoded password that will open it. When I receive the call, I will interrupt my activity or my leisure and head to the bank. If the newsstands are open, I will buy a copy of the Wren and tear it in half en route, throwing both pieces away at the next intersection. I am noting these quisquilii because, like so many others, they demonstrate the Domo's rational organization. There is no doubting that the Wren will become cantankerous when the banner of freedom is unfurled. I would be willing to bet that my dear brother keeps a copy of the proclamation, albeit encoded in his desk. If a torn copy of the Wren is now lying on the sidewalks of intersections, then thousands of people will go past it. The image will implant itself in their minds. It is not the condor who is at work here. This comes from below, from the nameless. A passerby has done it. It is also a warning, a disdainful greeting, a tug on the ribbon on which it fluttered.